The blue glow of my TV clock said 11:47, and I still wasn't tired. I used to think that was just part of getting older. After my wife died, the evenings got strangely long. During the day, I could keep myself busy enough. I could rake the yard, run errands, call my daughter, straighten the garage 3 times if I felt like it. But once dinner was over and the dishes were done, the house changed. It got quieter than any house should be. That was when I started doing what felt harmless at first. I left the television on. I carried my phone from room to room. I nibbled on crackers, then cookies, then whatever was easy. I dozed in my recliner with all the lights still on, woke up stiff, and then crawled into bed wide awake. That night, I remember rubbing my eyes and telling myself the same old lie. I'll sleep better tomorrow. Instead, I stared at the bright numbers on the cable box, then at the light from my phone, then back at the ceiling. My legs felt heavy, but my mind would not settle. I was tired in the most frustrating way possible. Too tired to do anything useful, not tired enough to sleep. And by morning, I paid for it. My head felt foggy. My patience was thin. My lower back ached more than usual. Even making coffee felt like a job I wasn't ready for. I finally admitted something that bothered me more than the poor sleep itself. It wasn't just nighttime anymore. My evenings were shaping my mornings. And my mornings were shaping the rest of my life. That realization didn't come from a doctor's office or a health article. It came from my front porch, with a mug of coffee cooling in my hand, and Eleanor Hayes walking past my sidewalk with 2 library books tucked under one arm. Eleanor had a steady way about her. Not flashy, not preachy, just steady. The kind of person who looked rested even before breakfast. She stopped when she saw me and asked, "Rough night?" I laughed, but only because she was right. I told her I'd fallen asleep in the recliner again and spent half the night awake after that. I expected sympathy, maybe a joke. Instead, she gave me a look that made me feel noticed, not judged. She said she had been dealing with her own sleep trouble too. That caught me off guard. I had assumed people like Eleanor had better systems than the rest of us. Better discipline, better habits, better luck. But she stepped onto my porch and told me that after turning 60, her sleep had changed in ways she hadn't expected. Some nights, she got sleepy too early and woke up at 3 a.m. Other nights, she stayed mentally alert long after her body felt tired. She said she'd started paying closer attention to what happened in the 2 or 3 hours before bed, and what she noticed surprised her. That was the first time I heard the idea plainly enough for it to stick. Better sleep after 60 doesn't usually begin in bed. It begins in the evening. I remember leaning back in my chair and feeling 2 things at once. Relief, because maybe I wasn't broken, and discomfort, because if my evenings were the problem, then some of the answer might be sitting right there in my own routine. Eleanor didn't lecture me. She just asked what I usually did after dinner. As soon as she asked, I heard how scattered it sounded. I told her I watched the news, checked my phone, snacked if I felt hungry, sometimes paid bills late, sometimes nodded off in the chair, and then went to bed whenever I finally felt exhausted enough. Saying it out loud made it sound less like a routine and more like surrender. Eleanor nodded slowly, like she recognized every bit of it. What struck me most in that moment was not embarrassment. It was relief. Relief that someone had heard the mess in my evenings and didn't rush to fix me, judge me, or brush it off as just getting older. I leaned back in the folding chair between our driveways while the last bit of daylight slid behind the roofs on Maple Glen Street. The air had cooled enough that I could smell cut grass from somewhere down the block. Eleanor Hayes rested her hands around a mug and gave me a look I remembered from years of watching good librarians help people find what they actually needed, not what they first asked for. I told her I figured tired was tired. If I fell asleep in the chair, that meant I needed sleep. If I woke up at 2 in the morning and couldn't get back down, that was just part of being 68. If I needed a handful of crackers or a bowl of ice cream before bed, at least it settled me for a little while. I expected agreement. Instead, I got a question. What happens the next morning? That one landed harder than I expected. I answered too fast at first. I said mornings were fine. Then I heard myself clearing my throat, buying time. Fine was not the word. My mornings had become slow starts, stiff legs, foggy thinking, and that hollow feeling of never quite catching up with myself. I still made breakfast. I still watered the tomato plant by the steps. I still got through the day. But more and more often, I felt like I was spending the first half of it trying to recover from the night before. Eleanor nodded once, not like she was surprised, but like she had been there herself. That was when she stopped talking about sleep like it was one thing and started talking about evenings like they were a chain. One habit pulling the next one into place. Or pulling it out of place. I remember the exact way she said it because it changed how I heard my own routine. The hour before bed usually doesn't start an hour before bed. I sat with that. Up to then, I had treated bedtime like a finish line. Stay awake until I was exhausted, get to bed, hope for the best. But listening to her, I could suddenly see something I had missed. My night was not breaking down at bedtime. It was breaking down much earlier. The television stayed on too long, and every loud headline kept my mind stirred up. The phone in my hand made me think I was relaxing when really I was jumping from one thing to the next. The late snack felt comforting, but sometimes it sat heavy. Paying bills at night made me tense. Falling asleep in the chair stole the sleep pressure I actually needed later in bed. None of those choices looked dramatic on their own. Together, they were steering the whole night. That was the first real boundary I had not wanted to cross. Admitting the problem might not be age alone. It might be the way I was ending my day. I felt defensive for about 5 seconds. Then I felt annoyed. Not at Eleanor. At myself. Because once I could see it, I could also see the cost. I had been giving away more than sleep. I had been giving away my mornings, my patience, my steadiness, and a little bit of confidence every day. I was starting to trust my body less. Not because it had betrayed me, but because I had stopped giving it a fair chance to settle. Across the street, porch lights began coming on one by one. A couple from the neighbors on Maple Glen Street walked a small dog past us and waved. I waved back, but my mind was elsewhere. I asked Eleanor what she changed when her own evenings got off track. That question mattered because it was the first useful one I had asked all night. Not, why am I like this now? The answer came from Eleanor Hayes so fast it felt rehearsed. She told me to pick one time at night when the kitchen was closed and mean it, even if I didn't feel especially disciplined. Then she said the second thing was smaller but harder. Give my mind less to chase after in the last hour before bed. No late news. No drifting from one video to the next. No standing in the glow of the refrigerator wondering what might somehow fix the day. I laughed once, quietly, because it sounded too ordinary to matter. That was exactly why I agreed to try it. By the time I crossed back to my own house, the porch lights on Maple Glen Street had settled into their usual evening pattern. A television flickered blue in one front window. Somewhere down the block, one of the neighbors on Maple Glen Street was dragging a trash can back up a driveway. Nothing dramatic had changed around me, but something had changed in me. For the first time in a while, I was not hunting for a miracle. I was willing to test whether a plain evening could do more for me than all my restless guessing. The first habit started at 8 p.m. I looked at the clock on the microwave, finished the cup of herbal tea I had already poured, and told myself the kitchen was done for the night. No crackers. No spoonful of peanut butter while standing at the counter. No, just one more bite, because I had stayed up too late and felt vaguely empty. I rinsed the mug, wiped the sink, and turned off the light above the stove like I was closing a small shop. It felt silly. Then it felt irritating. By 8:45, I was aware of every ordinary sound in the house and much too aware of the fact that I usually answered that hour with snacking. Not because I was hungry, not really. Because eating gave the evening a shape when I didn't know what else to do with it. I opened the pantry once, stared in, and shut it again. That was the first crack in the night I had been living without noticing. I had called it appetite. Half the time, it was drift. The second habit began at 9 o'clock. Instead of settling into my recliner with the remote and letting the television carry me from one loud thing to another, I switched off the set before I could negotiate with myself. The living room went still in a way that made me uneasy at first. I could hear the hum of the air conditioner. I could hear the ice maker knock once in the freezer. I could hear my own thoughts trying to convince me that one night of doing things differently was not enough to prove anything. Maybe it wasn't. But one night was enough to observe something. So I gave myself a quieter last hour. I washed up, laid out tomorrow's shirt and slacks over the chair in my bedroom, dimmed the lamp beside the bed, and sat for 10 minutes with an old library book I had meant to return weeks ago. Nothing about it was impressive. That may have been the point. My body did not have to brace against anything. It did not have to process breaking news, bright commercials, or the false urgency of other people's noise. Across the street, I could see Eleanor Hayes through her front window when I went to close my curtains. The television in her house was on. Not just on, flashing. I saw her pass through the room carrying a bowl, then come back for something she had forgotten. A little later, she was standing in the kitchen with the refrigerator door open, lit in white from the inside. I almost smiled. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm. Not dramatically refreshed, not transformed, but different. The usual heavy, cotton-headed feeling was lighter. My mouth wasn't as dry. My stomach felt settled instead of overworked. By lunchtime, I could tell that a slightly better night had followed me into the day. Nothing dramatic had happened. I was not suddenly cheerful, energetic, or years younger. But the fog had thinned. I made my coffee and toast without that irritated, dragging feeling I had gotten used to. I answered 2 emails I had been putting off. I even noticed that my shoulders were not clenched up around my ears. For a man who had spent too many mornings feeling like he had been dropped into the day instead of welcomed into it, that small shift felt important. That was what stayed with me when I saw Eleanor Hayes later that afternoon. I was out near the front walk, pretending to fuss with a potted plant that probably would not survive me anyway, when Eleanor Hayes came back from her mailbox. The difference in her face hit me before she said a word. The skin under her eyes looked darker. Her mouth had that tight, tired line people get when they are trying not to complain because they are already too worn out to explain it. I asked how the night had gone. I should have known better than to ask it casually. Eleanor Hayes gave a short laugh with no humor in it, and said she had been up at 1:10, again at 3 o'clock, and then close to 4:30. She told me she had tried reading, then warm milk, then sitting in the living room with the television on low, and somehow all of it had left her more awake, not less. By morning, she said, she felt shaky and strangely emotional, as if the whole day was resting on thin ice. I listened this time instead of offering one of those polite little answers people give each other across hedges. Then she said something that settled heavy in me. She told me she had nearly driven to the grocery store that morning and turned around halfway down Maple Glen Street because, for one unsettling moment, she could not remember whether she had meant to buy eggs, pick up a prescription, or go to the bank. Not one of those things mattered much on its own. What frightened her was the blankness. She said it out loud the way someone admits they have heard a strange noise in the house at night and are no longer sure it is nothing. I did not rush to reassure her. At our age, people excuse a lot by calling it normal. A rough night, a senior moment, a little forgetfulness, a little dizziness, a little low mood. But put enough little things together and they can start taking pieces of your freedom before you realize that is what is happening. Eleanor Hayes looked at me and said that was exactly what scared her. Not being tired. Not even being cranky. Losing confidence in herself. Wondering whether she could trust her memory on simple errands. Wondering if one more bad week would make her stop driving after dark, then stop making plans, then stop saying yes to things she used to manage without thinking. I could hear how much it cost her to say that. The truth was, she had always struck me as steadier than most people on our street. Organized. Thoughtful. The kind of person who returned library books early back when that was still part of her life, and probably alphabetized things for comfort. Hearing that kind of uncertainty from her made poor sleep feel less like an annoyance and more like a quiet thief. I told her my morning had been a little better. Not perfect, just better. I said my mouth had not been as dry, my stomach had felt calmer, and my head had been clearer. The minute I said it, I worried it might sound smug. But Eleanor Hayes did not take it that way. If anything, her expression changed in a way that hurt more. Not resentment. Hope mixed with frustration. She asked me exactly what I had changed. That was the moment the whole thing stopped being casual. The answer mattered more than I expected, because up to that point both of us had been treating the whole thing like bad luck. A restless night here, a heavy head there, a dry mouth, waking up too early, that vague tired feeling that follows you from breakfast to supper. Annoying, yes, but still random. Once Eleanor Hayes asked me exactly what I had changed, random stopped being good enough. I told her the truth as carefully as I could. I had not done anything dramatic. I had eaten earlier the night before, skipped the bowl of ice cream I usually talked myself into around 9:30, and turned off the television before the late news drifted into those noisy, angry stories that somehow leave your mind buzzing even when your body feels tired. I had also left my phone charging in the kitchen instead of on the end table beside my chair. Even saying it out loud, I almost shrugged it off. But Eleanor Hayes did not. Instead, she leaned back in her chair on her front porch and narrowed her eyes the way she probably used to when somebody returned a library book with coffee stains on the pages. Say that again, she told me. Not the better sleep part. The changes. So I did. Earlier supper. No late dessert. No bright screen in my face. No late night news. Phone out of reach. The strange thing was not that she listened. The strange thing was how quickly her own evenings started lining up beside mine, like two sets of footprints finally becoming visible in wet sand. She told me she had been eating late more often than she liked to admit, especially on the nights she lost track of time reading or sorting papers. Not huge meals, she said, but enough. Toast with peanut butter, leftover casserole, cheese and crackers that turned into more cheese and more crackers. Then, because she still did not feel settled, she would sit with her tablet for just a few minutes and end up scrolling through articles, messages, and headlines until her eyes were tired but her mind was not. That landed harder than either of us expected. For several seconds neither of us said much. Maple Glen Street was quiet except for a sprinkler clicking somewhere down the block and a dog barking once, then losing interest. What I felt then was not relief. It was embarrassment mixed with clarity. We had both been acting as though the problem belonged to the night itself, when a good part of it had been built by the hours leading into bed. I asked Eleanor Hayes what time she usually ate. She asked me how often I watched television with the volume too loud and the brightness turned up. I asked whether she used her tablet in bed. She asked whether I ever fell asleep in my chair and then woke up confused and shuffled off to bed at midnight. That one hit close to home. By the time we were done, a pattern had started to form, and once it formed, more pieces snapped into place. A heavy meal too late did not just sit in the stomach. It seemed to keep the whole body working when it ought to be winding down. Bright screens did not just pass the time. They pulled attention outward and made the room feel more awake than it was. And mental overstimulation, which was a fancy phrase for a very ordinary problem, turned out to be one of the biggest troublemakers of all. News, arguments online, suspenseful shows, emotional phone calls, even organizing paperwork late at night if it stirred up worry about bills or appointments. None of it looked dangerous in the moment, but all of it told the brain, stay alert, stay active, stay ready. That was the first real shift. We were no longer asking why sleep had become unpredictable. We were starting to see cause and effect. Eleanor Hayes went quiet for a moment, then said she wished someone had explained it that plainly years ago. For the rest of that evening, the conversation stayed with me more than I expected. It is one thing to recognize a pattern while sitting at a kitchen table with a cup of decaf tea between your hands. It is another thing to stand up, walk back into your own house, and realize that your habits have already laid tracks through the evening so many times that your body follows them before your mind catches up. I decided that night I was going to stop treating sleep like something that might improve on its own if I just waited long enough. Eleanor Hayes said she wanted to do the same. We agreed on something simple. No dramatic overhaul, no fancy products, no pretending we would become different people by bedtime. We would each start putting the habits into practice and pay attention to what got in the way. That sounded reasonable at the table. It felt much less reasonable around 8:15. My usual pattern had been comfortable in the way old routines often are. After dinner, I liked to settle into my recliner, let the television run longer than necessary, and snack on whatever was easiest to grab. A few crackers turned into handfuls. A little ice cream turned into a bowl that was bigger than I meant to fill. If I felt restless, I told myself I was unwinding. If I felt tired, I told myself I would go to bed soon. Then soon, quietly moved another hour down the road. That first evening, I shut the television off earlier than I wanted to. The room felt too quiet. I did not like it. Quiet has a way of bringing up everything noise usually keeps covered. I noticed the dishes in the sink. I noticed the unread mail on the counter. I noticed the little pull toward the freezer. None of that was a crisis, but all of it pushed against the new plan. I called Eleanor Hayes before I could talk myself out of the experiment. I expected her to sound cheerful and disciplined. Instead, I heard frustration in her voice right away. She told me she had changed into comfortable clothes, dimmed the lamps, and put her phone in the other room like we had discussed. 10 minutes later, she walked back to get it because the silence made her wonder whether anyone had texted, whether she had forgotten something for the next day, whether she should check the weather, whether one quick glance would hurt. One quick glance turned into 20 minutes. That honesty helped me more than encouragement would have. It made the struggle feel real instead of personal. We were not failing because we were weak. We were finding out how attached the brain becomes to stimulation, snacks, light, and late evening busyness. I made myself do the next step anyway. Instead of going back to the recliner, I washed the dishes, packed away leftovers, and set out what I needed for the morning. It was not exciting, and that was exactly the problem. Healthy routines rarely compete well with habits designed for instant comfort. By 9 o'clock, I wanted a reward for being so responsible. My mind offered one immediately, something sweet. That craving surprised me with how persuasive it was. I was not hungry. I knew I was not hungry. But my body had linked evening comfort with eating, and it did not care that I had finally noticed the pattern. I stood in front of the pantry longer than I cared to admit. In the end, I made a piece of toast with a little peanut butter and sat at the table instead of eating standing up in the kitchen. It was not a perfect choice, but it was a deliberate one. For me, that counted. The harder part came later. I had expected better habits to make me sleepy right away. Instead, I felt awkward in my own evening. Without the television flickering and the usual grazing to fill time, I became aware of every small discomfort. My knees felt stiff. My mind kept circling tomorrow's errands. The harder part came later than I expected. I had imagined that a quieter evening would feel peaceful right away, but what I felt first was exposed. Every old habit had covered something. The television had covered loneliness. Snacking had covered restlessness. Staying on my feet in the kitchen had covered how tired my legs really were. Once I sat down with my meal, turned the lights lower, and let the room stay still, there was nowhere for those truths to hide. That night was not perfect, but it was different. Instead of drifting from one distraction to another, I followed the little routine Eleanor and I had been piecing together. I kept my supper lighter than usual. I stopped drinking anything caffeinated late in the day. I left the bright overhead lights off and used the lamp by my chair. I stretched my calves and the back of my thighs for a few minutes beside the sofa. I wrote tomorrow's errands on a small notepad so they would stop marching around in my head. Then I went to bed at nearly the same time I had the night before. Sleep still did not arrive like a switch being flipped, but it came without the long wrestling match I had grown used to. I woke once around the middle of the night, listened to the quiet, and noticed something new. My heart did not feel as rushed. My thoughts did not scatter in 6 directions. I turned over, took a slow breath, and fell back asleep. By morning, the change was subtle but real. My body felt less like a machine starting cold. When I stood at the side of the bed, I did not reach for the dresser as quickly. In the kitchen, I noticed I was not hunting for sugar before I had even opened the blinds. It was only one morning, and I did not trust it completely, but I respected it. A few days later, Eleanor and I compared notes again out by the sidewalk, each of us carrying our own kind of evidence. Mine was not dramatic. I had been sleeping a little longer, waking a little less irritated, and moving through the first hour of the day with less mental fog. Eleanor said the biggest difference for her was focus. She had started reading in the evening instead of letting the news run late. And for the first time in months, she could remember what she had read the next morning without going back over the same page. That caught my attention more than the sleep itself. Good sleep had started as the goal, but what showed up during the day felt bigger. I was misplacing fewer things. I could follow a conversation without my mind wandering off halfway through. Even my balance seemed steadier when I stepped off the curb to get the mail. The usual afternoon slump still visited, but it no longer flattened the whole day. It passed. One evening, Eleanor suggested that we stop treating these changes like private experiments and pay closer attention to what they were adding up to. So I did. I noticed I was standing straighter at the sink. I noticed I had more patience when the grocery line moved slowly. I noticed the little lift that came from keeping a promise to myself 2 nights in a row, then 3, then 5. That may sound small to some people, but at my age, self-respect can either quietly grow or quietly erode. It grows when actions line up with intentions. It erodes when every evening slips away from you, and every morning begins with regret. What surprised me was how quickly a steadier evening started changing the way I thought about the rest of my life. Not in a grand, dramatic sense. In a practical one. If I could sleep better, maybe I could think better. If I could think better, maybe I could move better. If I could move better, maybe I could protect more of my independence. Eleanor saw something similar in herself. What I did not expect was how fragile new discipline could feel on an ordinary hard night. By then, the small changes had started to matter. I was falling asleep faster more often than not. Eleanor Hayes had told me she was waking up less groggy and no longer reaching for an extra cup of coffee just to feel human by 10 in the morning. We had both begun trusting the rhythm we had built. Lighter dinners, less late television, dimmer lamps, a short walk when the weather allowed, no heavy snacks right before bed, and a calmer last hour instead of carrying the whole day into the bedroom. It was not perfect, but it was real. Then one evening tested all of it at once. A summer storm rolled across Maple Glen Street just before supper, the kind that turns the sky green-gray and makes every house feel smaller. The power flickered twice in my kitchen while I was heating soup. By the third flicker, the microwave went dark, the clock on the stove disappeared, and the house dropped into that strange silence that comes when every electric hum dies at the same time. My first thought was not noble. It was familiar. I wanted comfort, and I wanted it fast. Years ago, a night like that would have turned into a private excuse. I would have told myself there was no point fussing with routine now. I might have driven out for a greasy takeout dinner, eaten too much because the evening already felt ruined, then sat in front of the battery radio with crackers, cheese, and whatever sweet thing I could find in the cabinet. Once I crossed that line, bedtime would slide later, and the next morning I would pay for it with a foggy head and stiff legs. That old version of the evening came back to me so clearly that I almost followed it. Instead, I found myself standing at the kitchen window, looking out at rain hitting the street in silver sheets, asking a harder question. Had I really changed, or had I only been behaving well while conditions were easy? That was when Eleanor Hayes knocked on my side door, holding a flashlight in one hand and a covered bowl in the other. She did not come to be rescued. She came with a plan. She said she had cold bean salad already made, some sliced turkey, and a thermos of chamomile tea she had prepared before the storm started. She also said, very plainly, that she was tempted to throw her whole evening overboard. Her habit, when stressed, was different from mine. She did not reach for heavy food first. She reached for stimulation. More news. More light. More activity. More reasons to stay mentally braced, as if staying alert could keep life from surprising her. Standing there in my dim kitchen, we were not fighting the same urge, but we were facing the same decision. I told her I had been thinking about driving out anyway, storm or no storm, just to break the tension and get something hot and filling. Saying it aloud made it sound less like a plan and more like surrender. So we made a different choice, and this time Eleanor Hayes was the one who pushed the evening in a new direction. We ate the simple meal at my table before it got too late. No second helpings just because the weather was bad. No grazing afterward because the room felt unsettled. After dinner, instead of sitting there feeding our nerves, we walked my hallway for 10 minutes with flashlights, back and forth between the living room and the front door, just enough movement to keep the body from freezing into stress. It looked ridiculous. It also worked. Then came the harder part. Without television, without the usual lamps, without our ordinary cues, the night felt unstructured. That is when routines prove whether they belong to the clock or to the person. Eleanor Hayes said she was going home before 9 to keep the rest of her wind down intact. Eleanor Hayes did go home before 9. I watched her step off my porch and disappear into the dim line of Maple Glen Street. And for a moment, I felt that old temptation to let the night unravel just because the plan had changed. That had been my habit for years after my wife died. If the evening slipped once, I told myself the whole thing was ruined. So I might as well stay up, snack too late, watch nonsense, and drag myself into morning half alive. But that night something in me finally understood the difference between a rule and a rhythm. I locked the door, left the overhead lights off, and kept the house quiet. I rinsed my mug. I wrote tomorrow's errands on an index card instead of carrying them into bed. I took my pills with water, not coffee. I stretched my calves against the kitchen counter, then my shoulders in the hallway. I checked the thermostat, turned my bedroom clock away from my face, and sat in my chair with one lamp on low while my breathing settled. No heroics. No perfect system. Just one choice laid gently after another. That was when the 7 habits stopped feeling like advice and started feeling like dignity. I did not need to win the night. I needed to stop fighting it. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm and stayed still long enough to notice what had changed. My mouth was not dry. My head did not feel packed with wool. My lower back still carried its usual complaint, but it was not sharpened by a bad night. Even my first steps to the bathroom felt steadier. Not young, not miraculous, just more like myself. When I stepped outside with my coffee after breakfast, Eleanor Hayes was already on her porch, holding her mug with both hands and wearing the expression of somebody who had made an interesting discovery. I crossed over before I could talk myself out of the moment. I slept, I said. I know, Eleanor Hayes answered. So did I. That was all at first. Not a celebration. More like two people confirming that a locked door had finally opened from the inside. Over the next several evenings, we kept at it without turning it into a performance. We ate earlier. We let the brighter lights go lower as the night moved on. We stopped letting the television choose our bedtime. We kept late caffeine and heavy desserts from sliding into the hours meant for rest. We made a short list for the next day, so worries had somewhere to sit besides our pillows. We kept our movements gentle but intentional, enough to loosen the body without waking it up. And we treated the last stretch before bed as preparation, not leftover time. That was the real change. Evening stopped being the place where the day collapsed. It became the place where tomorrow quietly began. The difference spread farther than I expected. My morning walks grew longer because I was less tired and less irritable. Eleanor Hayes said her reading returned to her in fuller paragraphs instead of foggy fragments. We both noticed fewer misplaced items, fewer sharp replies, fewer afternoons that felt stolen by fatigue. The body had not become younger, but life had become more usable. Before long, the neighbors on Maple Glen Street began to notice. Not because we preached, because we looked different in the morning. Lighter, more present. When someone asked what changed, I did not hand out miracle claims. I said what was true. After 60, sleep rarely improves by accident. It improves when evenings stop working against us. So I told them what helped me. Keep supper reasonable and not too late. Dim the house so the brain gets the message. Put tomorrow's worries on paper. Leave caffeine, big meals, and endless screens out of the last hours. Move a little. Slow down on purpose. Keep the bedtime rhythm steady enough that the body can trust it. Simple did not mean small. Simple meant repeatable. I still have imperfect nights. So does Eleanor Hayes.